Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Maternal Child Health Conference at ASU. Thanks for joining us again today. I just wanted to let you all know that as of this morning, we had 387 people registered, which was amazing numbers. And yesterday we noticed that there were up to 161 in any given session. So that's really great participation, and we're so excited to continue this tradition on. I just want to give you a brief overview of what's happening today, and then we'll jump right into it. So we're going to start out on a conversation about climate change and implications for maternal child health. And then we are going to continue our skill building work around issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we'll have a series of short presentations followed by a poster session. At the end, there will be an evaluation. Actually, that'll come out on Monday, and CEUs will be sent upon completion of that evaluation. So if you're looking for CEUs, that will be how to get them, and I will talk a little bit more about that at the end of the day. So now I want to turn it over to our first speaker. We have Dr. Santosh Pandipati, who is going to present on The Earth Has a Fever, a physician's perspective. It's a little bit of an introduction. He is the medical director for maternal fetal medicine at O'Connor Hospital in San Jose, California. He's a physician with board certifications in obstetrics and gynecology and maternal fetal medicine. He earned his medical degree from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, go Blue, and OBGYN residency at University of Washington Medical Center, where he served as chief resident. During that time, he received many honors, including election to Alpha Omega Alpha and Best Teaching Resident Award. He completed his maternal fetal medicine fellowship at the University of Colorado Health Science Center and is certified by the California Prenatal Screening Program as a provider of genetic amniocentesis, and is certified in Nuchal Translucency Review Program as a provider for first trimester genetic screening. His clinical interests include growth restriction, hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, critical care obstetrics, and Doppler ultrasound. He enjoys maternal fetal medicine for its blend of medical, surgical, and radiological practice, as well as the opportunity to provide skillful and compassionate care to both the mother and the fetus. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Pandipati. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I am honored to present before the audience. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. Okay, I hope all can see my slides. Today, as mentioned, I would like to present to you on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. The Earth Has a Fever, a physician's perspective. As mentioned, I'm Santosh Pandipati. I'm a maternal fetal medicine physician. I'm employed by Obstetrix of San Jose, which is part of Pediatrix medical group, formerly known as Mednax. I have no personal financial conflicts of interest to disclose. You know, for the last 2 years or so, we have been confronted across the globe with a pandemic, as everyone knows, in the form of COVID-19, but always looming in the background, and has been for a century or longer, is climate change. And climate change will pose a much bigger challenge to our species than anything we have confronted in our evolutionary history. It's easy to lose track of all the events that have happened, and 2021 turned out to be quite a devastating year. And again, we get lost in the day-to-day, and this is a nice brief summary of a few things as of mid last year that I just wanted to re-engage the audience with to understand what it is that we're really talking about.
Oh my God!
super hot here. So my partner and I, we set up some shade to help cool off our neighborhood and keep everybody safe.
It's already bad enough not having air conditioning, but to have no power at all in this heat is dangerous.
This is not the first wildfire of the season. It certainly won't be the last.
You hear reports of this from these people there, and you go, oh, poor people, that's horrible. But when you're with them, experiencing the same thing, gives you a different outlook on life, gives you a different outlook on compassion.
Donc ici au mois de juillet, mes deux petits-fils devaient être présents, ainsi que mon fils. Et cette nuit-là, ils n'ont pas logé là et ils ont eu cette chance. Autrement, ils étaient tous les trois tués.
Auswetter ist dann nicht, da sehe ich ja nichts mehr. Da ist nichts mehr. 2 Häuser, die sind hier weg.
Ein Hubschrauber, deshalb ist ja auch so schön ruhig, fliegt permanent, bis der letzte gerettet wird. Bis der letzte vom Dachflug haben. Das ist unvorstellbar.
It's going to the ground, it's going to the ground.
Oh my God, a tornado just hit our house. Our house is gone.
I looked back out, the fire was too close. I knew my house was going to go. Lost my whole life, everything I've ever had.
You spend a lifetime building like a family home, and it's heart-wrenching to have it just go up in smoke like that.
पूरा नीचे पूरा खड्डा गिर गया, पूरा पत्थर वित्थर सब आयल है, पूरा मट्टी हो गए और पूरा सामान पूरा नीचे गिर गया, इधर ऐसा कचरे के जैसा हो गया पूरा.
Конечно, страдаем. Дышим дыма.
Climate crisis, my friends, is the test of our times.
The biggest risk is that we miss this opportunity in 2021 to reverse the suicidal trend in which we are waging war with nature.
So I think that video captures very, very well, just within a very brief period of time, in 1 year, how many devastating events happened all over the world. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General in August of last year, said that this is a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. The crisis has gotten so profound and it is impacting human health so dramatically that the UCSF Winter magazine in 2020 said that very bluntly, the climate crisis is a health crisis and medicine must reckon with the coming catastrophe. So who am I and why am I speaking with you today? Well, as mentioned, I'm a maternal fetal medicine physician, but I've been worried about climate change for nearly 20 years, especially in regards to human health and survival and women's health in particular. I am a maternal fetal medicine director at a hospital here in South Bay area of California, but I think more importantly, I'm a husband and a father. I'm a concerned citizen of this country, and really fundamentally, most importantly, and what we all share together is we are members of a common species. Growing up, my father, who still works for NASA, had instilled in me an interest in broad thinking and understanding science and understanding where our place is in the universe in terms of a scientific setting. And really Carl Sagan and Contact and Cosmos really shaped my worldview. And I've always been thinking in a more global context in terms of where do we fit in and how do we thrive in our existence. I first presented to the University of Washington hospital system as a resident on this topic. And this was back in June of 2003. This is the actual PowerPoint title slide for my talk back then. And I thought at the time, 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago, that, man, maybe I'm just being a little bit too bold in my assertion here, calling it challenges to the survival of the human species. And little did I know that what we had been thinking may be confronting us by the end of the century is already going to confront us within a couple decades. So again, a few confessions, because none of us are perfect individuals. We all have an imperfect place in this world. So I'm not speaking to you as any saint. I only recently purchased an all-electric vehicle. Yeah, on our house, we have solar panels, but we also have gas heat and a gas range top. We did remodel our home recently, but that involved pouring concrete. But at the same time, we installed energy efficient appliances and LED lighting. I do consume animal products, including meat and dairy, but I've significantly reduced my consumption of beef, pork, and dairy. And many days I actually end up being vegetarian. And yes, I have 3 kids, but the good news is that they're all more environmentally conscious than I ever was at their age. And yeah, I confess, I upgrade my phone almost every year, but my phone manufacturer has a strong environmental stewardship track record and is converting to a 100% recyclable process with circular supply chains. So again, I am not a perfect human being, but I just wanted to get that out off my chest. I think it's important to understand some basic science, even as healthcare professionals, all of us in this audience. We do need to understand, because we're often confronted with this comment that, well, you're not climate scientists. What do you know about any of this? And I think it's important to understand some of the fundamentals here. So what do we mean by the greenhouse effect? Well, sunlight reaches the Earth. Some of this energy is reflected back into space. Some is absorbed and re-radiated as heat, and most of the heat is absorbed by greenhouse gases and reflected in all directions, warming the Earth. In fact, without these greenhouse gases, Earth's surface temperature would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit instead of the balmy 59 degrees Fahrenheit on average, as it is today. Now, the most abundant human-caused or anthropogenic greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. And of course, carbon dioxide is the most abundant of these. And global warming due to human-related carbon emissions has been predicted as long ago as 1904 by Svante Arrhenius. So this is not a new concept by any means. What's interesting is CO2 concentration has fluctuated from about 180 parts per million to 280 ppm in 100,000-year cycles over the past 800,000 years. But this concentration has been accelerating. And in fact, for about 200 years, from the onset of the industrial era of 1750 roughly to 1960, it increased from 280 ppm to 315 ppm. And then in the last 60 years, there's been a dramatic acceleration in CO2 concentrations up to about 420 ppm today. When you look at the famous Keeling curve based on data from the Mauna Loa Observatory going back 60 years, you can see the steady state increase or steady climb in CO2 concentration. But it's only when you go back in the thousands of years to hundreds of thousands of years timeframe that you can see what a sharp spike and how much of a deviation the CO2 rise really is compared to historic records. So the problem with all of this CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere is that it's causing increased surface temperature. And in fact, the Earth's global mean surface temperature increased by about 1.1 degrees Celsius between 1901 and the present. This is a rate 8-fold greater than that seen during typical ice age recovery periods. Now, thankfully, the oceans of the Earth, and I mean thankfully from a selfish perspective in terms of animal life on the surface of the Earth, the oceans have absorbed about a quarter of anthropogenic emissions and 90% of the heat energy from global warming. Now, when you look at the temperature deviation from the 20th century mean, you can see how unmistakable of a warming signature this really is, and how rapid this is compared to geologic history. Now, the reality is we don't live in a mean environment. We live in particularities and localities. And when you look at how this temperature rise is distributed across the globe, you can see that many parts of the globe, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, have warmed by nearly 3 degrees Celsius during this period of time. And when you look across the decades, across the surface of the Earth, with the most recent decades at the very top, you can see how unmistakable of a signature of warming this really is. And essentially every part of the globe has been affected. The warmest years on record are all from 2015 onward to today. In fact, you have to go well before modern Homo sapiens to the middle Miocene period to find a period of time when CO2 concentration was as high as it was compared to today. And this, at this time period, 15 to 20 million years ago, the average temperature was 3 to 6 degrees Celsius higher, and the sea level was 30 to 40 meters higher than today. Modern Homo sapiens are on the far left. We evolved in the last few 100,000 years doing very stable climatic conditions. So we are now living in an environment that we never as a species evolved under. Near where I live, I can actually see evidence of this ancient past, this ancient climate. We can go to Jack's Peak in the Monterey Peninsula, and we can climb Jack's Peak, which sits about 1,000 feet above sea level. And on the side of Jack's Peak, as you're hiking up Jack's Peak, you can see ancient sea life fossilized on the side of this mountain. And why is that? Because the sea level was dramatically higher than it is today. In fact, the sea was reaching up to where that sign is on the top right. You can see where the current coastline is and how much lower the shore is compared to where it is today. So everything you see was submerged under an ancient ocean when the climatic conditions were much warmer than today. This is all interesting, of course, that warming is happening, but how do we know that we are involved? Well, the observed increases in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations match the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and the changes in the isotopic ratios of atmospheric carbon-13 to carbon-12 that we see in tree rings and ice cores dating back thousands of years, well, these changes in these ratios temporally and proportionally match the onset of large-scale burning of fossil fuels at the start of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it's only when you model the human influence that you can actually replicate what we see in observed data. If you don't take into account human factors, you actually cannot account for observed data. So the tragedy about all of this is the general public has known about our role as human beings in climate change for at least 30 years. And the sad part about it is that even though we have known over the last 30 years, we've accelerated our emissions. In fact, if you're 30 years old, you've seen more than humanity's lifetime cumulative emissions, more than half in your lifetime. And if you're 85 years old, more than 90% of human species emissions have occurred in your lifetime. So this is very much a modern phenomenon. This is not something that goes back due to natural cycles or other, frankly, disinformation. And when you look across the globe and you look cumulatively, we have gone up and up and up in our emissions, such that we are currently emitting about 35 billion tons or gigatons of CO2 per year into the atmosphere. So who emits the most? Well, currently it is true that China is the largest emitter, but North America and Europe are not far behind, with the US responsible for 15% of global emissions. But when you look across time and cumulatively, well, the US by and far takes the biggest responsibility in terms of emissions, with the European Union being a close second, but matching a single nation in terms of the United States, and Asia much further behind. Now, when you look per capita or per individual at CO2 emissions, parts of the globe, individuals such as us, emit 15 to 20 times more per capita than other parts of the world. So there's a huge variation and inequity here in terms of emissions. So what is all of this doing? Well, we know that anticipated impacts of climate change include sea level rise, acidifying and heating our oceans, intensification of droughts, flooding, and storms, more frequent hot and fewer cold extremes, resulting in increased frequency and intensity of heat waves, more wildfires, as well as extreme weather events. I think the video clip at the beginning of this presentation showed you evidence of all of this. And when you look over the past few decades at the number of climate events happening per year, they are on the rise. These are major climate, hydrological, or meteorological events. So heat in and of itself, how does it affect us? Well, heat is lethal after several hours of exposure at sustained wet bulb temperatures of 95 degrees. So what I mean by that is 100% humidity, 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius. This is essentially equivalent to 115 degree heat at 50% humidity. At this temperature and humidity, we can no longer sweat and evaporate off our heat. In other words, there's no ability for evaporative cooling. And in fact, one of the adaptive evolutionary mechanisms we as a species have developed for our survival is the sweat mechanism. When you are at these temperatures and these humidities, our bodies switch from shedding heat to the environment to absorbing heat. And so after a few hours, essentially, we become cooked, so to speak. The horrific thing about this is that portions of the Middle East and South Asia already achieve wet bulb temperatures near 35 degrees Celsius today. There's also the problem of particulates and particulate air pollution, and especially the particulates that are 2.5 microns or smaller. These particulates are released from fossil fuel combustion, and these are so small that they can penetrate through our pulmonary vasculature and spread throughout our body. And they have been linked quite definitively in multiple studies to asthma, coronary artery disease, pulmonary malignancies, and premature deaths. So climate change absolutely is a health crisis because we live in this environment. We are not separate from this environment that includes heat and particulate emissions and other pollution. How do we get affected directly? Well, extreme weather events cause injuries, fatalities, and mental health effects. Heat stress can cause heat-related illness and death. Poor air quality leads to exacerbations of asthma and other respiratory diseases, respiratory allergies, and cardiovascular disease. Water quality and quantity are jeopardized, leading to higher rates of Campylobacter, cholera, and other problems. Food supply and safety is under threat, leading to undernutrition, malnutrition, salmonella food poisoning, and other foodborne effects. And of course, we have climates that are changing that are allowing vectors to spread, mosquitoes, ticks, and other vectors, leading to more spread of chikungunya, dengue, encephalitis, hantavirus, Lyme disease, and other viruses. And social factors. We can't forget the fact that as societies destabilize, especially the vulnerable ones, that you have physical and mental health effects from violent conflict and forced migration. So it's already happening. How do we know? Well, there was a very nice study in 2019 that looked at 10 climate-sensitive events that happened in 2012, just 10 events. And these 10 events were exacerbated by climate change, attributed to cause over 900 deaths, nearly 21,000 hospitalizations, nearly 18,000 emergency department visits, and $10 billion in costs. This is for the United States. One country, 10 events, 1 year. Now, as women's healthcare providers, which is my lens, I think it's very important that we understand the fundamental principles of climate change. We need increased awareness of climate change-related adverse impacts on women's health. We need to understand how we can assist and empower women in confronting the challenges of climate change, and we should understand how we can help mitigate climate change. Now, it's very clear that various populations of human beings are more vulnerable, especially up front to these changes than others. And among these are mothers and babies, and adverse pregnancy outcomes such as low birth weight, preterm birth, have been linked to extreme heat events and airborne particulates and flooding. Now, it's also true that given differing roles of that women and men play in many societies, as well as the unique reproductive burden that women have, climate change impacts are expected to have a differential impact on the sexes. And in many cases, unfortunately, these adverse impacts are likely to be worse for women than men by widening health disparities that already exist in many parts of the world. For example, heat-related morbidity and mortality. Women tend to sweat less, have higher working metabolic rates, and have thicker subcutaneous fat that prevents them from cooling themselves as efficiently as men. And unfortunately, the American and European heat wave data bears this out. 15 to 28% higher death rate among all women, 40% higher among elderly women. When you look at respiratory and cardiovascular diseases such as asthma and COPD, at baseline, there's an increased risk due to exposure worldwide due to particulate indoor air pollution from cook stoves. In fact, it's estimated more than 4 million premature deaths per year because of this, and it's anticipated to worsen from unabated fossil fuel consumption. We already know that anemia and malnutrition exist. Exacerbations of these disparities are anticipated. Physical and sexual violence has already been documented very clearly to be in higher incidence during times of natural disasters, leading to decreased life expectancy. And this, unfortunately, is anticipated to worsen as well. It's especially in societies with significant socioeconomic disparities between the men and women. Anxiety, depression, and other mood disorders are anticipated to increase. And with a breakdown of social safety nets, a lack of access to prenatal care, contraception, and family planning options. Now, there's specific, as a maternal fetal medicine provider, there's specific pathophysiology that harms pregnancy that I am particularly worried about. There's a reduced ability to thermoregulate in pregnancy, and we know that heat exposure alters placental blood flow, that reduces placental integrity and increases the abruption risk. There's an increased risk of exposure already to indoor particulates, but now also from outdoor, from wildfires. And there's adverse outcomes that are triggered by hitting various critical temperature thresholds that vary from region to region. There is increased susceptibility in pregnancy to pathogens such as malaria and Zika. There was a very, very elegant study that was released. It was a scoping review in JAMA in 2020 that looked at air pollution and heat as it pertained to preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth. And they looked at all the studies for the United States that looked at these associations, and they found that the overwhelming number of studies saw a clear association between higher rates of preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth with air pollution and heat. Sometimes these risks were as much as 10 to 30% higher. And unfortunately, a very clear racial disparity was borne out in the majority of studies where African American and Hispanic populations bore the brunt of these adverse outcomes. So air pollution in and of itself has been associated with, during pregnancy exposure, higher rates of asthma, eczema, allergies in the offspring, impaired lung development in the offspring, adverse neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism spectrum disorder and cognitive impairments. We now see evidence of some of the most harmful emissions are black carbon, which are emitted by traditional cook stoves, but also by wildfires. We now have found evidence of black carbon depositing on the fetal side of human placentas. And this is a horrific finding because it's very clear that our bodies are the pregnancy itself, which we have always viewed as a safe space, protected from the outside world, may not actually be so. Now, heat has been associated with higher rates of congenital defects, especially heart defects, conotruncal and septal defects, and it's estimated that some parts of the United States may experience as much as a 60% increase in these specific heart defects by the next couple decades. And it's been associated with a higher rate of congenital cataracts. We know that heat exposure in utero leads to higher rates of fetal distress, higher rates of need for ventilation, higher rates of meconium aspiration, higher rates of newborn dehydration and need for rehospitalization, higher maternal hypertensive disorders such as preeclampsia, which are more pronounced in African American populations. And we also have clear association with adverse psychosocial outcomes in offspring, diminished cognitive ability, and adult earnings from simply being exposed to excess heat in utero. there was a very interesting study published in 2010 by one of the leading speakers and researchers in this field, Rupa Basu, who works for the California EPA, where she and her colleagues looked at, for every 10-degree rise in Fahrenheit for the week prior, how much higher of a rate of preterm birth was there subsequently, and related to heat waves. And they looked county by county, and some counties have as high as like Alameda County, for example, they identified a 21% rise in premature birth rate simply by a heat wave exposure from the weeks prior. So really, really compelling evidence here. So natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, researchers have very clearly identified higher rates of gestational hypertension, depression, PTSD, and in the offspring who were exposed, their mothers were exposed to these hurricanes during their pregnancies, higher rates of preterm birth, low birth weight, elevated BMI, central adiposity later in life, and adverse mental health effects, including mood disorders and schizophrenia and autism disorders. So the natural question becomes, okay, well, we've talked about natural disasters and heat and so forth. What happens when we have all of it happening at the same time? Heat, air pollution, and climate disasters all conspiring. Well, what we now understand is that this leads to a continuum of harm where we have in utero effects, fetal growth restriction, prematurity, low birth weight, altered developmental programming, that then reverberates across the lifespan such that the offspring are now less well adapted to additional climate insults. And so they have a variety of predispositions in terms of neurodevelopmental disorders, cognitive deficits, birth defects, asthma, allergies, etc., obesity. And so now they're less well adapted to a rapidly changing environment. So in order to really have success at mitigating and adapting to climate change, we're going to need to understand the anticipated health disparities between men and women. And there is no avoiding the fact that our patients' health intersects with environmental science, energy use, agriculture, land use, and public policy. And it is true in many parts of the world that women have a responsibility as family caregivers that places them in very unique decision-making roles that can impact the climate throughout the day. Which appliances are used, which household goods, what are the family dietary habits and patterns, what is the education and shaping of children's energy consumption habits, and ultimately, how many offspring does any mother have? Women do have this unique interplay between population growth and climate change through reproductive behavior. The tragedy is over 200 million women annually in lower income nations desire greater control over their pregnancies, but lack access to contraception. And there are over 70 million unintended pregnancies worldwide. And we know nearly half of US pregnancies are unintended. And we also know very clearly that the number of offspring any mother has is linked with education. By simply meeting unmet contraceptive demands, so this is not any kind of coercion, we're just talking about the women who are asking for this, providing them the contraception that they want. This is ranked as the 7th most impactful change we could do, could reduce CO2 emissions by mid-century by 60 gigatons. It's very clear that CO2 emissions could be reduced significantly by 30% or more by 2100 by simply providing contraception to those who want it. And at the same time, we can eliminate over 100,000 maternal deaths worldwide per year. Why? Because you can't die from a pregnancy you never had. And this would, of course, lead to greater reduction in per capita emissions in developed nations and developing nations. It would prevent the birth of millions in developing nations who might contribute to future emissions, but it would, more importantly, slow rapid population growth as a way to build resiliency. So this allows nations that are vulnerable to climate change to develop adaptive policies. And it would lead, most importantly, in my mind, to improvements in women's empowerment, equality, and well-being by empowering women over their own reproductive fates. The amazing thing is this would cost less than $6 billion per year for providing contraception for the developing world, a pittance. Now, when you talk about education, what we're really talking about is not college education. We're talking about 12 years of fundamental education or schooling. And this is ranked as the 6th most impactful change we could do, reducing CO2 emissions by an additional 60 gigatons by mid-century. And the difference between a woman with no years of schooling and 12 years of schooling is actually about 4 to 5 children per woman worldwide. So this has a profound impact. And educating girls is considered by many to be the single most important socioeconomic factor to reduce vulnerability to natural disasters. And this too is not expensive. For the world to do this, it would cost less than $40 billion per year for low and lower middle income nations to have 12 years of guaranteed schooling. So by educating women about the impact of daily decisions, empowering them over reproductive fates, advocating for equal pay and career opportunities that provide means for self-reliance and resiliency, and elevating leadership roles, women actually, we don't have to be victims. We can actually flip the coin, and rather they can actually become powerful agents in mitigating and adapting to climate change. Cristina Figueres, one of the key architects for the Paris Accords in 2014, summed this up. Women are disproportionately affected by climate change impacts, such as droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events. But they also have a critical role in combating climate change, but need to be better represented at all levels in decision-making. Empowering women will be a significant factor in meeting the climate challenge. So what role do we have as healthcare providers? Well, one, we have to stop asking, what business is it of mine? We strive daily to effectively care for our patients with the assumption that our patients will live in environments that ultimately won't kill them. The imminent climate crisis will overwhelm and negate all of our historic public health and basic science advances we've achieved thus far. And here's my plea. Aren't we the conservation biologists for our own species? We as healthcare workers, and me as a physician, well, we took oaths to protect our patients. And so we have an ethical duty to act. And we actually have a platform to speak upon, although we often feel we don't. In fact, healthcare professionals such as nurses, doctors, and pharmacists rank consistently among the most trusted in the United States for where to get information from. So there are some immediate pregnancy recommendations. This is not pie in the sky stuff. We need to start telling our patients to be very careful about avoiding extreme heat, especially early in the warm season. Start monitoring aggressively the air quality index and particulate levels, and avoid outdoor exercise and activity at times of poor air quality. Advise the use of tick and mosquito repellents in at-risk geographic areas. Avoid wood-burning stoves and fires. Ensure access to prenatal diagnosis for patients who are at risk. Intermountain Healthcare has a very nice handout that they've developed back in 2015 that helps guide pregnant mothers in terms of what kind of activities they should do in terms of the air quality index. And this is something that should be routine, especially as we see more and more climate change befalling us. We also have a role to empower women over their own reproductive fates. And we need to educate men and women. And I saw research that just was published that we may actually be on the cusp of male birth control, which is high time, that reduces sperm counts or eliminates sperm production. So we need to start educating everybody on available options, especially long-acting reversible and permanent sterilization. We need to have unrestricted access to birth control, and we need to have enhanced access to prenatal diagnosis and termination options. But it's more than that. Nutrition and lifestyle, better diets and lifestyles to reduce chronic medical illnesses, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer, brilliantly dovetails with climate change mitigation. Educating our patients on healthy food choices and practices, emphasizing plant-based diets, could reduce CO2 emissions by 66 gigatons by mid-century. Switching to clean cook stoves could reduce another 30 plus gigatons by mid-century. Advocating for increased mobility via walking, bicycle riding, use of public transportation, assisting families with healthy, sustainable dietary and activity patterns could reduce an additional 10 gigatons. We very much have to engage in the political sphere in terms of advocacy. We have to oppose government interference in provider-patient relationships and care delivery, especially for family planning. We have to advocate for affordable and universal access to reliable and safe birth control. We have to prioritize politicians who understand this topic and are committed to implementing an all solutions approach, whether market-based or government-based. We have to educate patients on climate change and the impacts on their health. When I talk to pregnant mothers and I start connecting the dots here in California, that these wildfires have a direct impact on their pregnancies, that these heat waves have a direct impact on their pregnancies, light bulbs start to go off and they start to understand this isn't some theoretical issue. It's affecting their family right now. We need to expand opportunities for higher education, equitable pay, elimination of workplace gender discrimination. Why? Because we're talking about resiliency, and we're talking about improving sustainable agricultural practices, expanding of access to affordable and sustainable plant-based foods. We have to make it cost-effective to eat healthy, and we have to make it cost-ineffective to eat unhealthy. Each of us as healthcare providers can spread the message in our communities. Something I've been trying to do for 20 years, something I hope everyone in this audience leaves this talk saying that they're educated and willing to do this. As a healthcare industry, we ourselves are responsible for 10% of US emissions. It's time we start talking to our healthcare institutions to start implementing green policies. I've started engaging my own employer in this, and they've started to show some actual interest in doing this. As much as possible, look, I can't be smoking and then telling my patient to not smoke. We have to become, at least in part, examples of what we're trying to implement. So make diet, lifestyle, and personal changes that we prescribe to our patients. If you have personal investments, divest from fossil fuel companies. Try to offset your emissions from personal behaviors. I belong to an app that actually models how much my emissions are, and I contribute to that app on a monthly basis, cheaper than a latte every day, and it plants trees and funds solar projects and wind projects. These kinds of apps are out there. Put up solar panels, convert to electric vehicles, walk, run, bike as much as you can, vote. Vote for politicians who understand science and understand evidence-based policies. Take an introspective look, because why does it all matter? Billions are already at risk. The latest IPCC report very clearly shows over 3 billion people are already at risk to climate change, and billions more will be in the very near future, all over the world. We are unfortunately on a business as usual path, and that's modeled in this red line on the right, the RCP 8.5. In this business as usual pathway, by the year 2100, we are going to hit horrifically high concentrations of CO2, 1,000 parts per million. We never evolved even in the current conditions, certainly not at 1,000 ppm. And in physiology studies, at 1,000 ppm in closed environments, humans have 15 to 25% less cognitive function. In other words, this directly interferes with our brain function, our ability to make decisions, our ability to perform on IQ tests. And excess heat, I'm not even talking about CO2, I'm just talking about excess heat separate from the CO2, has already been shown to be associated with decreased cognitive performance and decreased childhood academic achievement. In fact, so much so, many parts of the Southeast close schools when it's too hot and humid because students can't learn. So if we continue on this business as usual pathway, we may just be too mentally impaired to even figure out a solution out of our mess by the end of this century. Our time is limited. We have to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by end of century to avoid the worst outcomes. We can only emit about 500 gigatons of CO2 before we exceed our budget. That's only about 8 years of current emissions. So the sad part about it is we should have already been bending, we should have already peaked, and we should have already been bending our emissions curve. Our current pledges and targets would achieve about 2.4 degrees Celsius rise, nowhere close to 1.5. And unfortunately, our current policies are not even as good as our pledges and targets and would lead to close to a 3 degrees Celsius rise. So we can flatten the curve, to borrow COVID-19 pandemic language, by reducing emissions, and we can buy more time. So everything I talked to you about, these gigatons add up. Contraception, diet changes, exercise, mobility, clean cook stoves, education, over 200 gigatons of reductions, actually nearly half the amount of our remaining CO2 budget to remain below 1.5 degrees rise. So climate change mitigation is absolutely in the purview of healthcare providers and public health experts and policy measures, not just fancy technology. And by implementing these things, we can start to buy time for those technological solutions. Unfortunately, we may have already crossed certain climate tipping points. It may be the permafrost, it may be the Arctic, in terms of snow ice coverage, it may be the rainforests, right? And it may be too late to prevent portions of the Earth from becoming uninhabitable by the end of the century. And we actually have to start planning for that. Because where we're headed at this point is on a business as usual pathway. Parts of the globe by mid-century will actually be 5 to 7 degrees Celsius warmer than they are today. And in fact, when you look across the globe, if you model 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees versus 4 degrees Celsius rise, from left to right, you can see how dramatic of a difference half a degree or a degree makes in terms of actual areas of the Earth becoming so horrifically hot, right? When you look at the United States and annual heat-related deaths, and you look at a business as usual pathway on the far left, modest emissions pathway in the middle, and aggressive emissions. Now look, all of these are leading to higher heat. And so there are definitely more heat-related deaths, even on an aggressive emissions reduction pathway. But if you look at the far left, on a business as usual pathway, we're talking about an additional 100,000 deaths per year just from heat in the US. So 700 per million in the population. When you look at Arizona, we're talking to ASU here. So if you look at Arizona specifically, it is projected that 6 Arizona counties, including Maricopa, will face times of year where it will be uninhabitable by human beings in 20 to 40 years without extreme measures. So this is very much something that is going to hit us and hit us sooner than we think. When you think about the wet bulb temperatures and what I was telling you before, wet bulb temperature predictions for South Asia where over 1 billion people live, by late this century, on a business as usual pathway on the far right, or even a moderate mitigation meaning we hit those pledges that we've made, and we're still, getting to 2 degree rise. Big portions of South Asia hit those lethal wet bulb temperatures during parts of the year. So where do hundreds of millions of people go when you are hitting survival related heat? So 1.5 degrees on the far left displaces 50 million people. 2 degrees leads to a sea level rise of 56 centimeters. 3 degrees, you lead to near complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet and eventually 7 meters of sea level rise. 4 degrees, 9 meters of sea level rise, and 700 million people at risk. When you talk about water shortages, well, the desert Southwest already is confronting this. And at 1.5 degrees, these water shortages will impact Australia, Brazil, Asia, the Mediterranean. At 2 degrees, 8% of the global population will face severe water shortages. 3 degrees, almost half of the Himalayan mountain glaciers will be lost. The Himalayan mountain glaciers provide water for about 2 billion people between China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and other nations. By the way, 3 of whom are armed with nuclear weapons. 4 degrees, extreme droughts. At 1.5 degrees, 9 out of 10 coral reefs at severe risk. 2 degrees, which is clearly where we're headed, all coral reefs gone by the end of the century, gone. 3 degrees, marine ecosystems may collapse, and at 4 degrees, all plant and animal species, half of them, will face local extinctions. Food shortages, significant reduction in agricultural yields at 2 degrees. Fish species, which provide protein for a lot of humanity, at 3 degrees go extinct in many parts of the world. At 4 degrees, we're talking about 2 billion people in terms of food insecurity around the world. So our time is limited, and everything that I'm talking to you about is not fixed in stone. They represent initial adversity to our species. This adversity will quickly become an existential threat as temperatures rise and tipping points are reached. Greta Thunberg said our house is on fire, but really I would like to say that the Earth has a fever. And what happens to human physiology when there's a 1 degree Celsius rise? What happens if we have an uncontrolled fever and our temperature keeps going up? We are stable, delicate, physiologic systems in equilibrium. When you disturb that equilibrium, it becomes very dangerous to our well-being. this is an uncontrolled experiment. Is this really something we want to conduct? And isn't there enough interim analysis data that we need to start now in aborting this experiment? And everything I talked about, these solutions would lead to a better world than before. So fighting climate change is not a zero-sum game. It's important to understand that human-induced climate change will have numerous adverse impacts to health, and women through their reproductive years are disproportionately vulnerable. And their offspring will be impacted lifelong. But women are also uniquely qualified to play a central role in mitigating and adapting to climate change. And as healthcare providers, we need to be aware of these potential negative impacts and how we can help our patients. And it's important to understand that we can't just sit around waiting for fancy technology. And actually, we have a role and a voice here, and we can actually make a difference. And we can push society as healthcare providers, but our actions have to be soon and they have to be efficacious. It's worrisome, of course, and I can leave you in a fear zone, but I want to leave you not in a zone of fear, but I want to leave you in a learning zone and hopefully in a growth zone. And again, what I mean by this is use this as the fire to fuel growth and improvement, not to be paralyzed in fear. 40 plus years ago, the Voyager 1 space probe turned around and took this picture of the Earth. And believe it or not, this is from a distance of 4 billion miles. This little dot, this bluish little dot in this sunlight is our entire planet from 4 billion miles away. And this is the furthest human technology has ever reached, right? And this has been named the pale blue dot by Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan wrote, inspired by looking at this, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity and all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes, settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. And ladies and gentlemen, I want all of us to make our stand today and moving forward. I want to thank all the fearless and brave climate scientists who've brought this information, now at their own political peril, to warn humanity about what is happening. My wife, my three children, Mother Nature, of course, my own mother, my father, who's inspired me, and a million other climate activists and environmentally minded healthcare providers, and all of you in the audience. Thank you for your time. And I know we're brief on time, but happy to entertain any questions or concerns or comments.
Wow, thank you so much. That was very powerful. Yeah. I hope that we do all walk away with a sense of learning and action and not paralyzing fear. Does anybody have any questions? We do have a few minutes. Let's see, it looks like in the chat someone posted, will we have access to the recording after the conference ends?
We do, yes.
Yeah, happy to share. I've shared with Lizette the slides, and again, I think the point is, there is a component of we got to shake ourselves up and come to some real reality discussions. And the recent war in Ukraine and the rise in gas prices, we should have already been resilient to these economic pressures. We should have already been 30 to 40 years ago changing our energy infrastructure and economy so we wouldn't be prone to this. It is a tragedy that even politicians who should be getting it are talking about releasing more oil to lower prices. So we are doing everything that is 180 degrees opposite to what we should be doing to save ourselves. And while my emphasis is on women and children, women and children are, of course, the linchpin to the survival of our species. And we have undervalued this. And I think the American Academy of Pediatrics has done a great job, frankly, more so than the women's leading healthcare organizations, at trying to ring the alarm bells, because they are seeing the impacts on children. And they are considering climate change as a leading cause of adverse effects on children's health, and potentially a leading cause of mortality and morbidity in the coming years. So this is an area where we as healthcare providers have been trepidatious, frankly, to say anything about this. And we've been quiet and on the sidelines for far too long. In my job, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a fully full-time practicing physician. Right after this, I've got to go see patients. And I bring this in the day-to-day to patients as much as I can. And their light bulbs go off one patient at a time. But we can't do it anymore one patient at a time. We have to do this societally and globally. And there is no doubt that these challenges are difficult. There is no doubt that it's not easy. There is energy poverty that is there. There is information poverty that is there in disparity across the globe. We first need to get off oil and gas. And I often hear this controversy. Well, yeah, but you plug in your electric car, but the electricity is from oil and gas. But we got to start somewhere. And then we push the power company to say, I want clean electricity. So I actually belong to a co-op that provides only renewable energy to our household, right? So this is how we start moving and bending the needle, right? So anyway, I can go on for a while, but I don't know.
Do you have any examples of like compelling language that you use with your patients?
Yeah, I think it's easy, unfortunately, here in the Bay Area, right? Because we've had heat waves and wildfires year after year over the last few years. So the reality hits home. I've had patients who've had to flee their homes because of wildfires during their pregnancies, right? So we have patients who come from Central Valley, and they're coming up, to see us for consultations. So agricultural regions and very hot areas of California. And so we see, I have seen anecdotally, where there are higher rates of oligohydramnios, low amniotic fluid volume from heat wave exposures. And then it resolves. We're following them closely, and then the heat wave goes away, and a week later it's all gone. There's no explanation other than the climate. And when I connect these dots and I say to patients, you got to pay attention to the particulates, you got to pay attention to the heat, especially early in the warm season, because these have been associated with higher rates of prematurity and growth restriction. In patients' minds, their light bulbs go off and they say, wow, this is not political. You mean this is actually affecting me? Yes. And this then becomes a powerful way for them to go back to their families and say, hey, this is about our family. This is about our children. And that becomes a very powerful message. And simply raising the topic is all you need to do. And in Arizona, you guys see this all the time, right? You live in heat. And so I think the reality is what we can do is simply educate the population. So then the next time that mother and that family, it's election season, and somebody's talking on the TV or on the internet saying they don't believe in climate change, they've already been told how it's directly affecting them. Healthcare workers are the closest people to science that most of the public ever come into contact with, right? So we are translators of scientific information, and we have a role to play, and we have a moral obligation to play that role. So,
wow. I see lots of great comments in the chat, and I wish that we had more time, because I think this is so important. I think, I'm more in the kind of prevention space, and we're just starting to tackle this on, the issue of climate change and how it affects mental health and physical health of, children and families. So, yeah, I'm definitely going to share this recording with my colleagues.
Thank you.
All right.
I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Thanks everyone for your, if you can stick around and address anything in the comments, but I know you have patience, so
I apologize.
and they probably take priority, but thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.